And welcome everybody to the latest edition of the Export to Japan podcast. It's great to have you here and on board with us. For this podcast, we're going to take a deeper look into the sectors of life science and healthcare in Japan. And I'm delighted to have two excellent guests with us today who I would love to introduce. First of all, we have Harry. These two guests, by the way, are from EY-Parthenon in Japan. Harry here, who you can see up on, I think, the left-hand side of your screen. Harry specializes in the life sciences industry in Japan, and he has extensive experience with both pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies, working on commercial strategy and digital excellence. Harry's also led multiple projects on product launches in Japan. So Harry, welcome on board. Great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this call. Really looking forward to discuss you about the Japanese healthcare market.
Great, thank you, Harry. Good to have you here. And then in addition, I'd like to welcome Christina. Christina specializes in international and global healthcare. She has significant experience working with the US government agencies, multilateral institutions, pharmaceutical companies, and public and private sector stakeholders. And Christina is also a fluent Japanese speaker. Christina, welcome. Great to have you on board too.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Okay, so I'd like to kick off with a couple of questions just to set the tone here. And Harry, if I may, I'd like to just bring you in and introduce these questions to you. And Christina, I'll come back to you in a moment. So just to kick things off, I understand that Japan is traditionally an import market for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Is this correct, Harry? And if so, could you expand on that and explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So if you look at the Japan market, first of all, the domestic demand is really big and it's growing every year. But at the same time, the domestic companies cannot fully fulfill this demand. So if we look at the major pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies, they all have subsidiaries in Japan. And if we look at the import versus export, so Japan import is always much bigger than Japan export. And one thing we noticed in recent years is that this kind of import trend is also, the amount is also climbing every year. So I think it's actually definitely good news for the UK viewers who want to enter Japan, because we do have a trend that there are more and more players that come into Japan to provide additional like medical device or pharmaceutical drugs to the Japan market.
So to summarize that, what you're really saying is the market opportunity is getting larger and the demand is getting larger. And in turn, that means the opportunity for foreign companies to export their products into the Japanese market is also growing in the same trend, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Great. Yeah, excellent. And you mentioned there a point about the Japanese companies, and they, within these sectors, do the Japanese providers tend to work more on supplying their own domestic market, or is there a big export market out of Japan for the Japanese companies in these sectors in general terms?
So in general terms, in Japan, you look at the pharmaceutical companies. The biggest is Takeda, but we also have Chugai Daiichi Sankyo here, and in medical devices, there's Olympus and Terumo. But at the same time, in Japan, there are only a couple of really big players who are really strong to compete in the global market, and if you look at the otherwise, there are actually a lot of really big to mid-size global players who eager to enter Japan. So it's definitely a dynamic here. So I think no companies can actually fulfill all the demands in Japan. And if we think about that, there's only a limited company in Japan can provide this kind of healthcare products. So I definitely think there's a lot of room for foreign companies to come to Japan to provide more innovative products, so that the healthcare in Japan can be even more improved.
Great. Well, that's wonderful. And I think for most of the listeners that listen into this podcast, that will be music to their ears to know that opportunity is there. So thank you for setting the scene on that. Just to sort of an additional question, just to try and put it in context, where does the Japanese pharma market rank in terms of world position? Do you have any view on that?
Yes. So from the rank, right? So Japan's healthcare market is ranked #2 around the world. So number 1 is US. And you can think about it this way, is that from the GDP perspective, Japan is #3 after US and China. But from a healthcare perspective, Japanese government is spending a lot on healthcare and to make sure that everybody can get healthcare. And that's why if you look at the only healthcare market, Japan is #2 in the world.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'd like to come on and explore that with both of you in some subsequent questions here in a moment. But yeah, thank you, Harry. That's really good for kind of setting the scene and the position to get us kicked off very nicely for this discussion. Okay, Christina, if I could come over to you now. So could you tell us a little bit more about this universal healthcare in Japan and public health insurance? Could you give us your views on that, please?
Right. So Japan has their statutory health insurance system, which is essentially their universal healthcare program. And it covers about 99% of the population, so pretty much everybody in Japan. And it's primarily funded through taxes and some individual contributions, but it's primarily just being handled by the government. So luckily in Japan, as we unfortunately have seen in some other countries around the world, access to healthcare and public health insurance isn't much of a problem here. Everybody has access to healthcare. So with the statutory health insurance program, you can usually enroll in 2 different ways. One is by through your employer, which is about half the number of cases. And so if you get a new job in Japan, they'll automatically enroll you into this health insurance program from your employer. And then the other option is through from your residency in Japan. So even though this is being handled by the national government, Japan is very decentralized with their health insurance program. So each prefecture, which is essentially the same thing as like a state or a province, they handle much of the enrollment for their residents for the health insurance program. But yeah, 99% of the Japanese population is covered through our universal healthcare program. It's one of the largest in the world.
Great, thank you so much. And how about looking ahead? What are the trends looking ahead, Christina? And do you think there's likely to be any increases or decreases in healthcare spending in Japan? What are your thoughts on that?
So like healthcare expenditures and financing, yeah. So there's a really there's a great group called the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. It's called IHME. It's part of the University of Washington in Seattle, and they do a lot of interesting research and work on health expenditures, health financing, and according to them, it's on per capita per person, a typical Japanese person spends about $4,000 per year on healthcare related costs. Much of this is being covered by the government, with some out-of-pocket costs and a small fraction of that is through private health insurance. But this figure is expected to double in about 20-30 years. By 20 to about $7,000 and $8,000 per person, which is definitely in alignment with the changing demographics of the country, with the need for long-term care and the Asian population. There are also changes to just the epidemiological changes in the country with more non-communicable diseases and comorbidities. So yeah, healthcare expenditure is definitely expected to increase significantly in Japan.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of really interesting points that have come out from the 2 of you, because from what Harry was previously telling us about the opportunity for international companies to penetrate the market and come into the Japanese market, and then secondly, backing that up with what you're saying, Christina, about the potential, some of these growth numbers in terms of the figures and the spend. There's 2 very interesting dynamics there, so that's really exciting. Okay, sticking with you for a moment, Christina. So we hear, the stuff we do on Export to Japan, we cover many different sectors and we help many different kinds of international companies come into the market. And there's always this view, whatever industry sector you work in, there's always this view that Japan is historically a really difficult place for foreign companies to get into, to invest in, to build their business. I'd like to get your opinion on that. Do you believe that's still the case? Do you see any changes in things like government policy, etc.? What's your take on that, Christina, please?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of changes within the last 20, 30 years, even within the last 5 years or so, where traditionally, I think there was a stereotype that Japan can be a difficult place for foreign companies and international companies to invest in. And part of that can be a cultural barrier, a language issue. But recently, there's been a lot more openings and laws and regulations that are being passed by the government to enable foreign companies to invest in Japan. Much of this was started also through our now former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, where he eased a lot of taxes, regulations, and different laws to allow competitiveness within the country, to enable innovation for foreign companies to invest in Japan. So it's definitely, it has changed a lot compared to the 90s and like the 80s today.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. And it's again, it's kind of interesting for our listeners to hear that and think about that. So again, I think what I'm picking up very clearly from what you're saying is that even what may have been some of the barriers in the past for foreign companies to make it difficult for them, they are slowly being eroded and coming down. So it's still a complex market. We know that, we can't underestimate that, but certainly not as difficult as it used to be. And the trend is for it to become kind of easier going ahead, right? Now, Christina, as I mentioned, you're a Japanese speaker and you obviously understand the culture over there very well. Just in very general terms, with the Japanese companies that you encounter or do business with, is things like English language skills something that you kind of come across with the Japanese companies that you're dealing with, or is that still quite a barrier that for foreign companies?
So it depends on the company. So gaishike, it's essentially another term for like international companies. So the company that we work for, EY-Parthenon, is a gaishike. It's a multinational company. We have offices all around the world. And so in these types of international environments, most people speak English. But then there are some domestic companies that are a little more conservative and traditional. And so there may be challenges with communicating in English, but I think in generally, you have to start learning English in Japan from, I think, elementary, middle school now. So yeah, most people in Japan, it's still a challenge compared to other countries around the world, but it's gotten much, much better in recent years.
Great. Okay, good. And it's also good to know that there's lots of organizations and support and infrastructure for foreign companies that need that help and support, right? So although that challenge is still there, there's lots of ways that people can get support. And of course, the work we do at Export to Japan helps a lot of companies like that. And maybe some of the work that you guys are doing as well is working with some international companies in that way. So it's good to know that help is out there. Okay, thanks, Christina. Harry, if I can just come back to you a little bit now. So what I'd like to ask you is regarding the healthcare market in Japan, do you consider it to be robust? And if so, what makes you think that? Could you give us your thoughts on that, please?
Yes, so I think I definitely think Japanese healthcare market is very robust industry. Just to give you an example, so even after COVID-19 hit, I think last January, February, the Japanese healthcare industry saw a temporary decline from March to June, but it quickly picked up from July. And now it's almost normal, but at the same time, there are some parts of the industry that are affected a little more. For example, the dental, eye clinics, or pediatrics. So these are the examples that people tend to delay the visit because they are not necessary. But after COVID-19 is gone, I would assume that this needs will go back to normal because people still have to go to this kind of clinics to fulfill unmet healthcare needs. And because of Japan is a very advanced society, people really have a high expectation on healthcare. I do believe that overall the trend is very robust even under the COVID-19 situation.
Great. That's so good to hear. Wonderful. And with that reference you make there to COVID, that's a really good time to kind of bring that up and talk about that a little bit more. And Christina, if I could maybe come back to you, what's your view? What opportunities do you see in the Japanese market post-COVID? And where do you think the growth areas may be looking ahead?
So I don't know if I want to make a distinction like pre-COVID and post-COVID, because a lot of these growth areas were already starting before COVID. So Japan, as we just talked about, it's a very high-tech. People have this perception that it's this 21st century country that's highly digitized and high-tech, but it's also really rooted in its traditions and can be very conservative. And so I think post-COVID, there's a lot of appetite for innovation and digitization of healthcare, whether that's remote healthcare, at-home care. There's a lot of investment towards like robotic technology, especially with the aging population. And in some ways, like Japan doesn't have a choice. With the population expected to decline by 30% by the end of the century, there's a lot of investments that's happening into digitization. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity for a lot of these companies to look into, and this is also true with like medical devices and pharmaceuticals, also like healthcare at home and whatnot.
So do you think with what you've just sort of explained there about the changing dynamic market and the changing landscape, and that's a pretty amazing statistic that you mentioned about the aging society and the declining birth rate. So these areas that you're talking about, the appetite for innovation and digitalization, et cetera, are they areas where international companies could potentially come in and offer solutions and take advantage of that changing landscape?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of innovation that's already happening in Japan. And Japan is one of the leaders, global leaders in innovative technologies around healthcare and in all industries. So I think the most ideal way would be to partner with some of these organizations to understand what some of the unmet needs are in Japan, to understand who are the beneficiaries, what are the changing landscapes in disease trends or needs by everyday Japanese citizens. And so I think that might be a really good way of ensuring that we're promoting innovation, but also in partnership with these foreign companies.
I mean, that's actually a really great point that you bring up there, because I could imagine for any of our listeners listening in, right, international companies listening in right now, there's clearly a picture emerging from what you guys are sharing with us. There's a picture emerging that there is definitely opportunity in the Japanese market for international companies. The barriers are coming down and will continue to come down. The opportunity is going to grow in the future. So there's a whole set of interesting dynamics there. But for international companies that are maybe having to make their first step into the Japanese market, if they're just thinking about it for the first time right now, it obviously can be a little bit daunting, and they've got an awful lot to learn. And I guess there's a lot of research to be done. And again, there's lots of ways to get that research. But I'm kind of interested in what you mentioned there about partnering, because do you think that's one of the solutions for international companies that are looking at the Japanese market, is to try and partner up or form a relationship in some capacity with a domestic company in Japan and kind of go forward together? Would that be your view?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and absolutely. And it's not something that can be, Japan is a very relationship-based economy. So even if we're talking about partnerships, it's not something that you can do overnight. You need to be able to build these partnerships over time, over a long period of time. So doing your homework in advance, understanding through partnerships, but also on your own, what these unmet needs are. And these partnerships, it's not just with other companies, it could also be with academia, it could be with research institutions, it could be with other domestic partners, stakeholders that'll play an integral role. So the ministry is also a great example, because Japan is has universal healthcare coverage. So the government is going to play a very important role in ensuring that people are getting the care that they need in the healthcare system, in the importation of new devices and new pharmaceuticals. So yeah, I think building this relationship over time is going to be a very good way of ensuring that it's a successful market entry.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Very interesting. Harry, if I could come back to you with the next question. You mentioned COVID a little earlier on your previous question that you answered. So I just want to come back on that a little bit. What impact would you say COVID is having on the healthcare economy? And what do you anticipate it will look like post-COVID?
Yes, so that's a really, really good question and difficult. So I think the impact is that so before COVID-19, the access to healthcare in Japan is quite easy. So especially for people who have a fever and any mild symptoms, they will just go to hospital and the health insurance will cover most of the expenses. But after COVID-19 situation, people tend to delay this kind of unnecessary unnecessary visit to the hospitals, and sometimes they cannot because hospital will have new policies like no visitor, like unless you have a reservation. So this really restrict the access to healthcare. And I think under these situations, like we see some trend that like their at-home care and picking up trend because the people still have the need to get healthy. So if there's a medical device that are for at-home usage, so that may actually pick up sales during this period of time. And also another thing I think we can also revisit a little bit is telehealthcare. And Japan traditionally is very restrictive on this kind of instead of going to hospital directly, I have face-to-face with a doctor through this computer like we're doing right now. So Japan is very conservative on that, but COVID-19 really forcefully opened a door for this kind of possibility in Japan. So I think even after COVID-19 actually was out of the way, I don't think they will completely return to normal. I think the digitalization journey, which is also will begin in Japan as well. But I think that in the future, this kind of telemedicine or connected care will pick up trend even more.
Yeah. And there's no doubt, I guess that's a global situation, isn't it? It's a very kind of exciting trend, if I can use that as the appropriate expression. It's being driven by an unfortunate circumstance, but it is an exciting trend to see how technology is moving that way. But as you're painting the picture of the size of the Japanese market and the opportunity there, it's clearly a huge one for this kind of innovation and these kind of trends. So yeah, so thank you for bringing that out. That's really exciting.
Maybe just to add to that, Steve, I think
sure, please.
Also open doors so right now, about a third of our population is over the age of 60. And so there are cases where people may not be able to go to the hospital or seek the care that they need, may not be able to drive. So I think opening up telemedicine and some of these digitization methods will improve access to care for patients who need it most.
Yeah. That's a point brilliantly made. Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to re-emphasize that statistic you just gave us there, because that's amazing. You said a third of the Japanese population is over 60 years old. Is that right?
Yeah, I think a little bit less than a third.
Yeah. Okay, but very generally.
The exact statistics, but I want to say like 29%, 28%.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an amazing statistic, actually, isn't it? For us to get our heads around that and really think about that, that's a very interesting dynamic, and good that you highlight that in terms of thinking about where the opportunities and where the needs may be and where the support may be. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. Thank you. Okay, Harry, just sticking with you for a moment. There's a question I want to ask you here to pick your brains on. So we're definitely getting a very interesting story, and the picture is being painted very clearly about where the opportunities are and the size of the opportunity and the trends that are going on here. How about if we look at the competitive situation? So for international companies that may have a product or a service, if they're coming into the Japanese market, but there are already some solutions there that may not be exactly the same, right? There may be some unique points that they've got, but if there is a sort of a competitive situation already out there, what advice or thoughts would you have to foreign companies if they find that situation when they're looking at the Japanese market?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So when I ask this a lot to a lot of the potential companies who show interest into coming to Japan, and then when I ask them what's their first needs, they always talk about like to find a good importer in Japan, and they can import their product. But actually, I think there's one step even before that. So before any company who want to enter Japan, I think Steve, as you said, Japan is potentially a very competitive market. And before any company coming to Japan, at least we need to do a proof of concept to understand the potential value of this market entry. How much is there for you to enter Japan, and how much sales you will gain in 3 or 5 years? And we also need to understand that if you enter Japan, what's your winning story? How you want to win this market? What's the amenities there you will fill? And then with this information, then you can use this to attract potential importers who shows interest. So I think there's just a homework we have to do even before we talk to the importers. And then if we can do this step really well, the market entry journey will be much smoother.
Got it. Yeah, that's very wise advice, and I get that completely. Okay, great. Now, building on that a little bit, taking that a step further, we know that there's this expression that is often used in Japan of it being a strong relationship economy. Harry, what does that mean for foreign companies wishing to enter the Japanese market?
Yes, so yes, so that is definitely a correct expression, and as Christina also already elaborated this a lot. So in terms of market entry, is that so I think the reason why we said that it's better for a newcomer, especially before it become a global conglomerate, and in Japan it's better to have a partnership. Instead, you can leverage the existing relationship with Japan because Japan is a relationship market, and a lot of people actually do not want to do business with the person they meet first time. So it's really important to have some player, to have some a partner already playing in this market to help you to set things up, and that will actually save a lot of times. A lot of companies, for example, if you very ambitious that direct set up subsidiary in Japan, the first thing they may enter is that how do I meet the potential customers? And in Japan, it's really difficult because the information is not quite transparent. You may not find the customer at first, in the first month or in the first year. But if you have a partner, the situation that will be very different. So I think definitely relationship is the way to go, especially as a first step to enter Japan.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, Christina, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to add that it's also like navigating around the complex business intricacies in Japan that might, especially for our UK viewers, that it might not necessarily, for example, the United States, when you're comparing Europe and Western countries, the United States, it might be some of these customs may be more transferable, but that's not necessarily true in a place like Japan, where what works in the United States, what works in Europe, it's just a completely different business custom in Japan, and having a good partner who can help you navigate through all that I think is priceless.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that you've led into a really interesting area there, Christina, and some really good tips there on understanding the business customs. I mean, is there anything else while we're picking your brains there? Anything else in particular that you can share with our listeners and our viewers about understanding the business customs, or anything that's unique about Japan?
It's a good question. I mean, there's plenty of resources to help kind of get an understanding of what that might look like. But one example is, I just encountered this the other day, but if somebody says interesting in Japan, that might not literally mean interesting. It might mean something else. So things can get lost in translation. Seriously, some things can get lost in translation. It actually could mean that it's not a good idea. So, things like that, you would never know that if you were only working in the United States, or if you were coming from Europe, but somebody in Japan might be able to help you navigate around that.
Understood completely. I mean, a question from me on this topic of the dynamics of the market. One thing that I've heard with the various companies that we've worked with over the years is that people tend to think Japan is a very slow market to do business. You need a long-term investment strategy. You need to think long-term and plan long-term. You've already touched on some of that, of talking about the importance of the research and gathering information and finding the right partner and building the relationships and things. So, I mean, from your particular sectors where you guys have expertise, what do you tend to think? Does it tend to be a very slow burn? Or do you find sometimes if international companies have got the right solution at the right time and they meet the right partners quickly, can business happen quicker? What's your general feel and experience on that?
Maybe, sorry, go ahead, Harry.
So I think if the question is if it is a fast market, slow market, it's definitely a slow market, and I think this is partially due to the Japanese promotion law. Is that medical device or any pharmaceutical companies cannot be advertised to general public. You can only actually promote it through MR or sales representative to doctors, and that's really limited the channel that this kind of doctors and to get the information around the new product, unless you have a relationship there. And I think in terms of market entry, I think in actually every market you want to enter in, that will always be a long-term investment, because every market has a really, really unique characteristic. And Japan is just no exception. And Japan has already a very predefined way of doing business. And if we as a newcomer to come to Japan, we need to play the rule as well. We need to learn the rule. We need to actually find a partner that they can help us understand the rule. So I think all of this actually take time. So for a newcomer to find a good position in Japan.
Okay. Thank you. Christina, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say another adjective that you could use is, instead of slow, thorough, especially in the life sciences and healthcare industry. The Japanese healthcare system is incredibly thorough when it comes to importation of new drugs, pharmaceuticals, and an example of this is actually the COVID-19 vaccine. So even though Japan essentially had bought their COVID vaccine, was one of the first countries to buy the COVID vaccine stock, they're taking a little bit longer than some of these other countries like the UK or the US and a few others to roll out the vaccine, because they were doing their own clinical trials in Japan, in addition to the clinical trials that were already being conducted through Pfizer or Moderna. So Takeda, which is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in Japan and globally, they're partnering with the Ministry of Health here. They're partnering with Moderna to do their own clinical trials, to also lead the supply chain distribution. So yes, things might take a little bit longer compared to the FDA or some of these other regulatory agencies, but it's also because they're incredibly thorough.
Okay, got it. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm keeping one eye on the time, so we need to sort of get towards the point of wrapping up now, but there's just a couple more topics I'd like to bring up, if I may, before we conclude. Harry, if I can come back to you, what advice do you have regarding the value chain and how to engage with it?
Yes, I think that's another very good question. So Japan has a very unique value chain. For example, in our cases, there's like a newcomer coming to Japan, so they will go through an importer. An importer then actually sell to a wholesaler or dealer, and then the wholesaler can sell to hospitals or clinics. So this is very defined in Japan market. So I think first of all, again, as Christina said, that we need to do our homework to understand this structure, and also we have to understand the channel margin that each player will get from this, so that that as a newcomer, we understand how much price we will get when what price we should sell to the importer to secure our margin. So I think this value chain is actually very important to set the expectation how much value you'll get in Japan.
Yeah, okay. And that kind of links actually to probably my final question, which was, I was just going to ask you generally about the Japanese procurement system. And I know that's a huge question, and we could probably fill a complete podcast on its own talking about the complexities of it. But just in general terms, could you just give us a very high level overview of how the procurement system works in Japan?
Yes. So I think this actually the Japanese procurement system for each hospital or clinic are probably common to every country, especially for the large hospitals. Like there will be a procurement department, and the key opinion will come from the department head of each functions of the hospital, and they will make joint decisions on the very big investments such as MRI or CT machine. But for smaller spend, that won't impact the cost that much. Maybe the procurement team will decide which one to choose. And I think like this is the situation probably is really common to every market. But at the same time, like another thing to call out is that when you promote to the hospitals, you really have to gain a channel that to the people who actually make these purchases. So like it's very important to leverage your existing relationship, so they can actually somehow reach out to the procurement team, so let them know there's a product there, and so that they can purchase.
Got it. That's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, we're probably at the end. I mean, I could go on and on. There's more to discuss, and I would love to spend more time picking the brains of you two. But you've definitely given us a really great overview, and we've certainly covered all of the topics that I wanted to cover, and you've answered them so transparently and so thoroughly. So so I really do appreciate having this opportunity to get two experts on the line like this, and really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge. I think in conclusion, what I'm feeling from this discussion is you've given some very good indications of the size of the market and the fact that there is definitely opportunity for international companies to come in, and there is a need for international companies to come in. The market is going to grow, so those opportunities are there, and the growth areas for opportunity are there. And you've given us a great insight into where some of those key growth areas in particular may be. So that's very exciting. It's been great to get your ideas on the right kind of strategy, you know, doing your homework, doing your research, taking time, having a long-term thought process. That whole point you made about partnering and finding the right partner and working together locally, and how that can actually accelerate and help things move along quicker by taking time to find that partner. That's another key message that's come out. And you've given some great insights into the sort of local dynamics and the infrastructure and the unique points about the market. So so some really, really interesting stuff, and we've picked out a lot in a very short space of time. So thank you. Just a quick word for our listeners now. You know, I hope you found that all sort of interesting and informative. And in terms of what we do now and where you go now, if it has provoked your thoughts about the market, what I would definitely say is use the Export to Japan platform to have a good look round at the additional information and resources on that platform. There is in particular, there's a partner network of partners that may be able to help you and give you advice. Certainly, if you have any questions, particularly for Christina and Harry, if you send them into us at Export to Japan, we'll be happy to field those questions and forward them on to Harry and Christina and their colleagues. But any of the other partners we've got on the platform. And then just a reminder that within DIT, over at on the Japan side, at the embassy and the consulate in Japan, there is an excellent team of specialists that have a wealth of knowledge on the Japanese market and have helped many UK companies enter the market and build business there. So you can have access to that team as well. I know that team is busy. They're limited resources and they have a lot of inquiries, but certainly if you feel that you would like to be connected to that team, send us your inquiries or your questions in, and we can look at those and field those and help you get through there. So, but in general, any questions you may have, feel free to send them in to us at info@Export to Japan, and we will field those questions and get them through to the right people and come back to you. So thanks to everyone at home for listening in here at home or the office or wherever you are these days. And it just leads me in conclusion to go back and thank our excellent guests and speakers today. Harry, thank you so much for your time. It's been great speaking with you. And Christina, you also. It's been a pleasure. And thank you both for your time. Thank you.
Our pleasure.